The fundamental difference between knowledge and black magic isn't actually found in the content of what one learns, but in the ethical direction of the intent behind it. It's a provocative claim made by Mustafa Sajjad Haider in his 2026 reflections, where he argues that what we call black magic or Kaala ilm is effectively just the weaponization of knowledge for destructive ends. While rationalists often dismiss the supernatural as superstition and spiritualists view it as a separate dark reality, this thesis suggests both are seeing sides of the same coin, the duality of human capability. It challenges the idea that Kaala ilm is a set of secret evil spells, and instead frames it as any knowledge, be it psychological, scientific, or spiritual, that is stripped of its moral compass.
That perspective really shifts the ground of the debate. Often when people hear black magic, they think of obscure rituals or forbidden books like the Pakatrix, which historical researchers like Syed Haider Jaffrey have discussed as ancient texts blending astrology and alchemy. But Haider's argument moves us away from the mystical how and straight to the ethical why. He uses the analogy of a simple piece of metal. If you sharpen it to cut wood or build a home, it's constructive, what Sufi tradition might call Nuri ilm or luminous knowledge. But if you sharpen that same metal to take a life, the knowledge of metallurgy hasn't changed. The application has. It becomes black because of its shadow intent.
It's an interesting bridge between the spiritual and the material. If we look at modern medicine, the parallel is almost chilling. A doctor uses anesthetics to perform a life-saving surgery, which is clearly Nuri ilm in a secular sense. But if that same practitioner uses their expert knowledge of sedation to commit a crime, as Haider notes in his examples, then the science hasn't changed. The expert understanding of human biology is the same, but it's been inverted. In that moment, the doctor is practicing a form of black magic because they're using specialized knowledge to bypass someone's will and cause harm.
Exactly, and that leads us to the technical breakdown of how this inversion works. In many spiritual traditions, there's a concept of ilm-e-nafi, beneficial knowledge. This is knowledge that improves the self and the community. The opposite is not just ignorance, but knowledge that feeds the ego, or nafs. When you study the history of alchemy, for instance, you see this tension. Spiritual alchemy was about the great work of purifying the soul, metaphorically turning leaden human traits into the gold of divine character. However, what we might call dark alchemy was the literal pursuit of wealth and power at the expense of others. The technical tools, distillation, fermentation, calcination, were shared, but the gold determined the color of the art.
But isn't there a danger in oversimplifying this? If we label any bad use of science as black magic, aren't we just using a scary spiritual term for what is essentially just human greed or malice? A skeptic would argue that calling a crooked doctor a black magician adds a layer of mysticism that isn't necessary to describe a criminal act. They might say that by doing this, we're giving Kaala ilm more credit as a reality than it deserves, especially when psychological research, like that mentioned in the National Medical Journal of India, suggests that beliefs in black magic often stem from cultural stress or mental health struggles rather than actual supernatural forces.
That's a vital counter-argument, and it brings us to the nuanced perspective of how these two worlds interact. The skeptic is right that the effect is often psychological. Modern psychology recognizes the nocebo effect, where a person's belief that they've been cursed can actually lead to physical illness or extreme stress. But if we define magic as the ability to influence reality through focused intent and specialized means, then psychological manipulation is a form of magic. When a healer or a black magician uses fear to control a victim, they are utilizing real psychological levers. They are exploiting the brain's tendency to spot patterns and intent in chaos. Whether you call it a curse or coercive control, the mechanism of using knowledge to dismantle another person's autonomy remains the same.
So in this framework, even something like the eugenics movement of the early 20th century could be viewed through this lens. Figures like Francis Galton used the knowledge of biology and statistics to create a system that dehumanized millions. It wasn't pseudoscience in its own time. It was the cutting-edge application of what people thought was truth. But because its intent was the suppression of undesirable groups, it fits Haider's definition of knowledge being used as a dark force. It's black magic dressed in a lab coat.
That's a profound way to look at it. Historians of science often point out that the line between magic and science was very blurry for centuries. Alchemists were the predecessors of chemists. The difference was often the spiritual container the knowledge was held in. In Sufism, knowledge is never seen as neutral. It's a responsibility. There's a famous prayer where the Prophet Muhammad asked for protection from knowledge that does not benefit. This suggests that knowledge without a positive impact is effectively a spiritual weight. When that weight is actively pushed onto someone else to crush them, it becomes the sifli or lowly knowledge associated with black magic.
Let's dive deeper into the psychological dimension. If a person believes they are under a spell, their reality changes. They might become hypervigilant, lose sleep, or experience psychosomatic pain. In this case, the black magician is using a profound understanding of human vulnerability. They aren't just using words, they're using a technical breakdown of how fear works. Is it fair to say then that the true difference is simply the removal of consent? Nori ilm empowers the recipient to grow, while Kaala ilm seeks to bind them.
Consent is a huge part of the ethical boundary. Think about hypnosis. In a therapeutic setting, a patient gives consent to be hypnotized to overcome a phobia or addiction. That's Nori. It's using the mechanics of the mind for healing. But if someone uses those same techniques, suggestion, repetition, emotional triggers, to manipulate a person into doing something against their own interest, that's spiritual or psychological abuse. The magic here is the skill of bypassing the conscious mind. It's interesting how ancient warnings about sorcerers often mirror modern warnings about predatory gurus or cult leaders. Both use a deep knowledge of the human software to overwrite the user's admin privileges.
We also have to consider the cultural legacy and impact of these beliefs. In many societies, the fear of black magic is a real social force. It can lead to the isolation of individuals or even violence against those accused of practicing it. If we accept the thesis that black magic is just the misuse of knowledge, does that help or hurt the people living in those cultures? On one hand, it demystifies the evil by calling it misused knowledge. On the other, it might validate the idea that magic is a real thing to be feared just by another name.
It's a double-edged sword. By reframing it as the misuse of knowledge, you're essentially calling for higher ethical standards in how we handle expertise. It moves the focus from how do I break this supernatural spell to how do I protect myself from manipulation. In Sufi psychology, the primary defense against dark influences isn't more magic, it's tazkiyah, the purification of the heart. The idea is that if your own internal house is in order, external suggestions or manipulations have nothing to latch onto. It's like having a strong immune system against psychological pathogens.
There's a historical example that comes to mind, the work of Robert Oppenheimer. When he saw the first atomic blast and quoted the Bhagavad Gita, saying, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," he was acknowledging that his team had unlocked a fundamental secret of the universe. The knowledge of nuclear fission is in its essence just a description of how atoms behave. But the application was a weapon of mass destruction. Many of the scientists involved struggled with this for the rest of their lives. They had used luminous inquiry into the nature of reality to create the ultimate black outcome.
And that's why many ancient spiritual traditions were so secretive. They didn't hide knowledge because they were elitist. They hid it because they understood that power without character is a catastrophe. If you give a child a scalpel, they won't become a surgeon. They'll just get hurt or hurt someone else. This forbidden knowledge wasn't forbidden because it was inherently evil, but because the human ego wasn't ready to handle it without turning it into a tool of dominance. This is the core of the Babylonian test of Harut and Marut mentioned in the Quran. They taught knowledge as a test to see if people would use it for harmony or for causing separation between people.
So if we take Haider's thesis to its logical conclusion, the black in black magic isn't a color or a specific ritual style. It's the blackening of the human soul as it chooses to use its gifts to diminish others. This would mean that a lawyer using a legal loophole to ruin a family, or a tech company using algorithms to addict children to a screen, is technically practicing a form of modern Kaala ilm. They're using a deep technical understanding of systems, legal or neurological, to achieve a selfish, harmful end.
Exactly. It broadens the definition of magic to include all forms of influential expertise. The Nori path is about service and the Kaala path is about servitude, making others serve your will. If we look at it this way, the contradiction between the rationalist and the spiritualist disappears. The rationalist sees the technical mechanism, the lawyer's logic, the coder's script, the doctor's chemicals, and the spiritualist sees the metaphysical impact, the broken family, the lost soul, the violated body. Both are correct. The tragedy is when we separate the knowledge from the ethics, thinking we can have one without the other.
It really comes down to the individual's choice at the moment of application. Knowledge is a mirror. It shows us what's possible, but the hand that holds the mirror decides where to reflect the light. If you reflect it to illuminate a path, you're a guide. If you reflect it to blind someone and rob them, you're what the ancients called a sorcerer. The tools haven't changed in thousands of years, only our costumes have.
And that's perhaps the most empowering takeaway from Mustafa Sajjad Haider's perspective. It puts the power back in the hands of the individual to discern the color of the knowledge they encounter. It invites us to look past the symbols and the jargon and ask, is this meant to set me free, or is it meant to tie me down? Once you start asking that, the mystery of black magic starts to look a lot more like a simple, albeit dark, human choice. It reminds us that our greatest protection isn't a counterspell, but our own commitment to using what we know for the good of those around us.
The true test of any science or spirituality isn't how much power it grants the practitioner, but how much light it brings to the world. If you found this exploration of knowledge and its ethical boundaries compelling, share this episode with someone who enjoys digging into the deeper connections between science and the soul.